The 1950s are often remembered as an era of soaring tailfins, gleaming chrome, and endless boulevards. But behind that metallic shine, Detroit was not merely a celebration of speed and style. It was a battlefield where every automaker waged its entire destiny on steel, oil, and the American dream. There were cars born to redefine luxury, engineering, and identity. Yet, they ultimately became the final epitaph of an entire empire. Alongside familiar names like Chevy or Ford, there were also automakers that poured their final breath into a single block of steel, hoping for a miracle, and then quietly faded away. In this video, we will not talk about the powerful. We talk about the great losers, the final cars carrying the soul, the ambition, and even the mistakes of 1950s Detroit. We begin with Chrysler Motors, founded by Henry J. Chrysler. He came from the world of shipbuilding, steel, and war, where the impossible became the standard. He carried with him a dream of manufacturing smarter, differently, and faster. The 1955 Chrysler Manhattan was the clearest embodiment of that dream, and also its most painful farewell. From an engineering standpoint, the Manhattan was far from ordinary. Under the hood sat a 2.26 cubic inch flathead, inline 6, a configuration already outdated in an era dominated by V8s, but when fitted with the McCulloch supercharger. The result was 140 horsepower, an impressive figure for a 6-cylinder engine of the time, enough to allow the Manhattan to stand shoulder to shoulder with many mainstream V8 models. The car also featured a wide wraparound windshield curved like an aircraft cockpit, a design that carried the breath of the future. The interior was trimmed in cloth and leather with finely detailed gauges and an airy cabin, all of it showing that Chrysler understood exactly what Americans wanted after the war: comfort, light, and a sense of moving forward. The problem was this: all of it was too expensive. Unlike the Big Three, Chrysler lacked the scale to absorb those costs. Every Manhattan sold became a tense accounting equation. The stubborn decision to retain a 6-cylinder engine, even with supercharging, bred customer skepticism, while production costs remained painfully high. By 1955, the dream came to a close. Chrysler withdrew from the American passenger car market, leaving the Manhattan behind as an unfinished message. Next comes the name Continental M2. Introduced in 1956, the MK2 was not born to compete in volume. It was born to prove that Detroit 2 could create perfection. Under the hood sat a 368 cubic inch V8, producing between 285 and nearly 300 horsepower, operating as smoothly as velvet. But power was not what made the Mark II different. What made it a legend was this: each Continental ME was nearly hand-built. A dedicated X-frame chassis, body panels assembled with a level of precision never before seen. Before delivery, the M2 had to pass the most stringent quality inspection process in Detroit history, to the point that many Ford engineers at the time called it irrational. And then reality struck like a cold hammer blow. With a price of $10, equivalent to a suburban mansion at the time, the M2 entered a world to which it never truly belonged. Worse still, Ford lost thousands of dollars on every car sold. Each M2 leaving the factory was a flawless work of art and a financial loss on the books. By 1957, the Continental M2 came to an end. Not because it was bad, not because it was weak, but because it was too good, too refined, too far removed from the ruthless logic of the American automobile industry. If Packard was once the royalty of Detroit, then the 1958 Packard Hawk was an aging king wearing borrowed armor, stepping onto the battlefield in silence. There was a time when the name Packard was synonymous with power, refinement, and the standard of America's upper class. But after the bitter merger with Studebaker, Packard no longer had its own chassis, no longer had its own engines, no longer had an independent engineering path. The Packard Hawk was born in that context as a final attempt to keep the name alive for one more selling season, one more fragile breath. From a mechanical standpoint, the Hawk was anything but weak. Under the hood sat Studebaker's 289 cubic-inch V8, fitted with a McCulloch supercharger producing around 275 horsepower. On the highway, the car accelerated with raw aggression, the supercharger's whine rising like a challenge. By the numbers, this was one of the most powerful cars ever to wear the Packard name. A kind of strength that was unmistakably American, perfectly in tune with the spirit of the late 1950s. But the Packard Hawk did not die from a lack of horsepower. It died from an inescapable contradiction. The body was that of a Studebaker Golden Hawk, while the fiberglass nose tried to wear the face of Packard. Two identities collided on the same block of steel. And then 1958 came to a close with it. The Packard name on an American-built car disappeared. And do you think the supercharger on the Hawk was a stroke of genius, or merely an act of desperation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd truly like to hear your perspective. In the early 1950s, when most American cars were still tall, soft, and prone to leaning through corners, Hudson chose a completely different path. They introduced the revolutionary step-down design. The floor pan was placed below the frame rails, dramatically lowering the center of gravity. The result was a Hudson Hornet that hugged the road like a European car, stable and precise in a way that left competitors genuinely unsettled. Under the hood sat a 308 CI in inline-6, paired with the twin H-power setup using dual carburetors. The horsepower figures might not look shocking on paper, but the abundant torque and relentless durability turned the Hornet into a nightmare on the racetrack. Those consecutive NASCAR victories did more than bring home trophies. They delivered pride to an independent automaker bold enough to challenge the Big Three. But Detroit did not survive on racing victories alone. The market demanded new styling every year. Longer bodies, lower profiles, more chrome. And here, Hudson's genius began to turn into a burden. The step-down design, brilliant from an engineering standpoint, was extremely expensive to redesign. Every small change in exterior styling triggered massive structural costs. Costs Hudson could no longer afford to bear. While GM and Ford changed outfits every year, like swapping suits, Hudson gradually began to look old on the showroom floor. Even though beneath the surface, it remained an exceptional machine. Buyers started to turn away. The racetrack was no longer enough to save the accounting books. By the mid-1950s, Hudson was forced into a merger, and the Hornet name gradually lost its original soul. Next comes the name Dotto Adventurer. Born to fill the gap between Dodge and Chrysler, a mid-level brand refined enough to aspire to, yet affordable enough to reach. From a technical standpoint, the Adventurer was far from outmatched. Under the hood was an early-generation Hemi Fif 8, the very weapon that built Chrysler's reputation on both the street and the racetrack. Abundant power, massive torque, and smooth high-speed cruising made the Adventurer a car truly built for the American highway, where ribbons of asphalt stretch all the way to the horizon. In terms of design, Dotto wore Virgil Exner's forward-look philosophy, a long, low body with tail fins soaring like rockets. It was a bold design language that made the car feel as if it was surging forward even while standing still. The Adventurer looked commanding, confident, and perfectly aligned with the optimistic spirit of America at that time. But then, 1958 arrived like a cold wind. The economic recession made buyers cautious, and as the market contracted, Chrysler began stepping on its own feet. Dodge models grew too upscale, while Chrysler continued lowering its own price barriers. Dotto was squeezed tightly in the middle, left with no room to breathe. The adventurer became a casualty of that overlap. By 1961, the Dotto name disappeared. Not with a loud collapse, but like a brand quietly erased from the drawing board. If Detroit ever had a scar, it never wanted to revisit. It was the Edsel citation. No brand was ever born with as much research, expectation, and money behind it as Edel, and no name collapsed as quickly, as painfully, and as publicly. This was not just the failure of a car, it was the tragedy of absolute faith in marketing. In the late 1950s, Ford believed it could calculate the tastes of America. Thousands of surveys, years of analysis, and an unprecedented air of mystery in its advertising campaign. From that effort, Edsel was born. Not as an ordinary car brand, but as a kind of social invention. Edel was promised to be the car Americans did not yet know they wanted. From a specification standpoint, the 1958 Edsel citation was hardly deserving of ridicule. Under the hood sat the E475 V8 with a displacement of 410 cub in delivering a peak torque of 475 lb-feet. An enormous figure even by today's standards. On the highway, the citation could pull hard, smooth, and with authority. This was a car born to devour the long miles of America. Edel also came loaded with a range of advanced technologies. The most famous was the Teletouch system, a push-button gear selector placed directly in the center of the steering wheel. A bold idea that carried the breath of the future. On paper, it promised convenience and modernity. In reality, it became a maintenance nightmare. Minor electrical and hydraulic issues, which might have been tolerable if the system were located on the dashboard, turned disastrous when placed on the steering wheel. The one place where a driver never wants hesitation. But the fatal blow did not come from the engine or the Teletouch system. It came from expectation. Marketing painted an image that the car itself could not carry. And then, when buyers stepped into the showroom, they were met with the controversial horse-collar grille, inconsistent build quality, and a product that was not what they had been promised. Looking back at the names we've just passed, there is one thing that needs to be said clearly and fairly. These cars did not fail because they were bad. On the contrary, most of them were too good, too different, or too honest to their own identity in a world where accounting and scale were the true arbiters of life and death. 1950s Detroit did not forgive being out of step. A car could be outstanding in engineering, but if it failed to align with the machinery of mass production, it would be discarded without mercy. The Kaiser Manhattan was too idealistic, while its financial resources were running dry. The Continental M2 was too perfectionist in a city that lived by the assembly line. The Hudson Hornet was ahead of its time in chassis design. Yet, trapped by that very structure, the Packard Hawk tried to cling to its identity through horsepower, while Edel believed advertising could replace a true understanding of the market. Today, it is precisely those losers that are being sought after. A properly restored Continental M2 can be cherished far more than many best-selling cars of its era. The Hudson Hornet, once dismissed as outdated on the showroom floor, has now become a mechanical icon revered by collectors. Their value does not lie in sales numbers, but in the stories, philosophies, and engineering courage they represent. The mass-market Chevys and Fords fulfilled their historical mission, putting America on wheels. But these failed cars did something else. They showed just how boldly Detroit once dared to dream. They dared to experiment with unconventional chassis structures. They dared to build cars as works of art. They dared to place identity above profit, even if only for a brief moment. If you've ever sat behind the wheel of one of these cars, tell me what that moment felt like in the comments below. And if you value stories like these, Subscribe to the channel so we can preserve together the beautiful ghosts of 1950s Detroit. See you next time.